Becoming a watchmaker is certainly not something that is a normal course for young people in the US. It's hidden and not really spoken about. A lot of times when people ask me what I do and I respond that I'm a watchmaker, it blows people away, especially here in the US. It's not something you hear very often. A little more common if you're in Switzerland, but here in the US there's not a huge number of young watchmakers. So I want to take a little time to talk about how I became a watchmaker and what things kind of led me to discover watchmaking in the first place. I grew up as a watch-loving kid, and I didn't even think about watchmakers until I was a teenager. Even though I had had at least 100 watches at that point pass through my hands, I never thought about the people that make them. I never thought about anything behind the scenes. It was just the watch itself. As a young kid, I didn't ask my parents for toys. I didn't ask them for skateboards and things like that. I asked them for tools, and they gave me woodworking tools. They bought me my first watchmaking tools. And with those tools, I built things. I have a pretty vivid memory of building a longboard, a skateboard for myself. I didn't want a skateboard for my birthday. I wanted the tools. And so I built it. And I had other family members asking me, like, how do you know how to do this? And I didn't know how to do it. I had the foundation of a little bit of knowledge and that drive to experiment, right? To try and learn on my own. And I got that from my grandfather on my mother's side, who built the skyscrapers in Manhattan. All of the skyline there, the Verrazano Bridge. He was one of those immigrants up hundreds of feet, thousands of feet above the ground, doing extremely dangerous work and hard work in order to provide for his family. I don't have any watchmakers in my family that I'm aware of. And that's a big thing when people ask me, how did I become a watchmaker? Usually they expect me to say, my father's a watchmaker or my grandfather's a watchmaker. But having no watchmaking background and to find myself in a watchmaker role is quite unique. My relationship with watches started when I was a little kid, only about 4 years old. My great aunt actually gave me a Swatch watch. That same great aunt, while I was staying at her house with my father, his watch fogged up in a jacuzzi. And she had this wonderful idea to take that watch, a quartz watch, a Casio, and open it up to discover what's inside, right? And see if it could be fixed. So she took me inside her house, and we found a little screwdriver to open up the 4 screws on the case back of that watch. We opened it up, and that was my first experience that I remember seeing inside of a watch and all the little pieces. It being a quartz watch, you have a circuit board and some little electronic parts, but it was still something that intrigued me and was very fascinating. We couldn't fix it, but she told me we should take the insides out, and she gave me a photo of myself to cut into a circle. And then I placed that photo inside the watch and closed it back up. I still have that watch to this day. It's the one watch that has been in my collection and will never leave. The strap has disintegrated, but the case is still there and my photo's still inside. It relates a lot to what I do now because I have this belief that watches today, mechanical watches, are not really about telling time. And my most prized watch doesn't tell the time. It simply has the memory of my great aunt and her exposing me to my first kind of watchmaking experience. And for me, that's the best watch. Just that memory is what's so valuable to me. Another watch that had a huge impact on me growing up was a Mickey Mouse watch. I had my Mickey Mouse watch as a kid, and I still have it today. It was a quartz watch, plays a little Mickey Mouse tune, and the hands on the dial. The Mickey Mouse hands go around the dial. My father also still had his Mickey Mouse watch from when he was a child, and it opened up my mind to mechanical watches being tools, right? Not luxury items, just tools. Because his watch that he had as a little 5-year-old boy in Brooklyn was a Mickey Mouse mechanical watch with 17 jewels. And thinking about a little kid running around the streets of New York with a mechanical watch makes me realize that these mechanical watches were not luxury items. They were necessities. That was the only watch. There was no quartz. And to me, that was really intriguing to think about the fact that now, today, we produce these items as luxuries. But what we're really doing is keeping them alive. Because there's no real need for a mechanical watch today. It's completely driven by passion for the art and the craft. It's not about the time. My mother's side of the family came from Newfoundland, Canada, to the US in New York City. My grandfather, back in Canada, would build boats. Every year they would build a boat and they would go out cod fishing. And they were fishermen by trade. But they would build their own boats. And to me, that always blew my mind to hear that they were making the tools to practice their trade. Anyway, he ended up coming to the US and becoming an iron worker in the US. And he taught me everything I know about building things. One of the stories I love most about him was that he was building a boat in his backyard in New Jersey. And his goal with this boat was to take the boat up the Hudson River all the way out and into Canada and go back to Newfoundland. And to me, that is incredible, to have that kind of dream, to build something for such a journey like that. Not just buy it, but build it. Now, my grandfather on my father's side was not a builder. He was not particularly mechanically inclined, but he was a small business owner. He owned and operated a restaurant in Brooklyn. And my father worked there and eventually owned and operated his own business on the West Coast. That made a huge impact on me in that I always wanted to be able to work for myself and build a business on my own. One watch that is very important to me is my grandfather's watch. My grandfather, Irwin, he had a gold watch with a diamond bezel. And this watch was given to him by his wife back in the 70s. It had a solid gold bracelet. And when I was attending watchmaking school, I took the bracelet off of that watch and I sold it for scrap value. That helped me pay for living expenses while I was going to watchmaking school. So for me, I look at that as my grandfather being able to help me become a watchmaker. And I think that's something that he would be proud and happy to have helped me become a watchmaker and eventually own my own business. I realized that I wanted to make watches that could be pulled from a safety deposit box or passed down from generation to generation without having that immediate recognition of being from a certain time period. I wanted the watch to be something that 100 years after its creation, someone could look at it and say, wow, that is the ideal watch, and I could wear that today. So timelessness is really important for me, and that has a lot to do with that Angelus watch that I could not see myself actually wearing, but I still hold on to it because of the sentimental value. I collected a lot of watches when I was a kid. As young as 4 years old, I had a little stash of watches. And it just kind of grew from there. I remember when I was a little older, maybe around 12 years old, 13 years old, I had a 5-gallon jug that I kept in my closet, a 5-gallon water jug. And I would fill it with coins and dollar bills, and that was my watch fund. I would take that 5-gallon jug and I would bring it to the bank. I would roll up the quarters and the pennies, and I would usually have enough money for one watch, maybe 2 watches. I'd go down to the local store that sold some what I thought were really cool quartz watches. I was really into different complications like stopwatches and tide functions, moon phases and things like that. That really intrigued me, being able to track more than just the time. So I'd buy watches and learn about them, and I had a little collection going. My neighbor at the time was a garage sailor. He would cruise around garage sales early in the morning and pick up watches. He was a collector, and every once in a while he would find some really nice watches at these garage sales. Rolexes, Omegas, some really nice vintage pieces. And he would keep those for himself, but when he found something interesting that was less expensive, he would buy it for me. So I had some watches that were gifts from him, and that was really nice to have someone older teach me a little bit about collecting watches and kind of help that passion of mine grow. That was around the time in my life that I learned about watchmakers. There was a family friend whose son went to a watchmaking school, and I had never heard of watchmakers, but I had always collected watches. And I think my parents might have thought it was a little odd that I collected watches as a kid, but they told me about this guy that went to watchmaking school and got a job for Rolex. And that kind of ignited this interest in trying to turn watches into a career. But I had so many other things going on at that time. You know, being a kid, watches and watchmaking, I still couldn't really figure out exactly how I was going to become a watchmaker, and if that was even the right thing for me. So I ended up going to USC for business. I got into the University of Southern California to attend the Marshall School of Business there. And I thought, this is great. I want to own my own business someday, and this is exactly what I need to do in order to own my own business. I need to learn about business. pretty quickly after starting at the University of Southern California, going to a business school, I realized that business school was not really for me. I needed to follow a passion. And I realized that I needed to leave in order to follow that passion. The passion was watchmaking, making things with my hands. And I made the decision to leave USC. I thought if I could follow my passion, then the business will follow me. So I dropped out of USC and took a job at a machine shop. And in hindsight, it's pretty amazing that my parents were supportive. They were not upset with me leaving school. They were very supportive. And that was how I got my start in making things. I made underwater camera housings with a CNC mill. That was where I first became exposed to manufacturing. CNC mills, CAD and CAM, which are both for design and manufacturing, using computer programs in order to assist in that. And from there, I was able to use my free time to discover more about becoming a watchmaker. So while I was working as a machinist, I applied to a watchmaking school. And I had discovered this thing called WOSTEP. It's the Watchmakers of Switzerland Training and Education Program. And it's a Swiss curriculum that's now taught all over the world in order to train watchmakers, usually for restoration and after-sales service of Swiss watches. So I applied, and my application was actually past the deadline for applications for the next year. So I guess they just had very few applicants that year, and they allowed me to come out and sit for a little test, even though I was late on the application. I sat for the test, and I must have done well because they called me back and accepted me into the program. They were tests like making numbers out of little wire springs and putting balance wheels into watches. Little things that I now know were designed to test my patience and test my hand-eye coordination. They wanted to know if I would be a willing student and that I'd actually be able to sit through 2 years of full-time watchmaker training. While I was at USC, I met Whitney, my wife. And even after I dropped out of school and took a different job, we ended up moving in together after she graduated from USC. She knew at that time that I was a bit obsessed with watches. And when I applied to a watchmaking school and got in, we had to make the decision of, were we going to move together? Because we had to move from California to Miami, a cross-country move. So it was a big decision, and she came with, and we've been together ever since. I chose to go to a WOSTEP school because it's a Swiss curriculum. Even though this school is operated in the US, it's teaching a Swiss curriculum, and it's a diploma and certificate that is the same as if I had gone to a school in Switzerland. So what's really nice about that is when I go to Switzerland, the other watchmakers there also have a WOSTEP certificate. It's internationally recognized. It's not an American-only thing. So for me, that was really important because I saw how powerful the Swiss industry is in watchmaking. The watchmaking schooling, you start with micromechanics. These are the things that help us make parts and make parts to such a precise level. We really focus on perfection, making parts down to tolerances of 1 micron, and doing it with traditional equipment. We actually would use these little lathes that we would hand crank the lathe with one hand, and we would hold the cutting tool, the graver, in the other hand. So we'd be spinning it and under magnification, making the cuts and holding tolerances within 1 micron. Learning all of these old techniques to watchmaking and restoration, that's kind of the base where we start. From there, we move into oiling and repair of new timepieces, the theory behind chronographs and perpetual calendars and these other things that really only relate to watchmaking. Whereas the micromechanics is any kind of micro machine, really training ourselves to see even the tiniest flaws in something that we've made. From a few feet away, most things look perfect. But when you're under 10 times magnification, right up close on a watch, that's when you start to see flaws. And the goal in watchmaking school is to always be able to produce something that is flawless to that 10 times magnification, because it's highly unlikely that an untrained person with a 10 times magnification loop is going to be able to find any problem with your work if you've made it perfect to your own eye at 10 times magnification. The closer you get, there will always be flaws in anything handmade. But holding yourself to the highest level of perfection is really what watchmaking is about. Throughout the 2 years of watchmaking school, we would take tests. And these tests were meant to prepare you for the final test. The final test is part written exam, part micromechanics, and part after sales service. Meaning, with after sales service, we would actually be repairing a watch. And we would repair multiple types of watches during that test. For that test, we had a watchmaker from Patek Philippe, a watchmaker from Audemars Piguet, and the head of WOSTEP fly in order to grade our tests. So these are outsiders grading our test in our school. And if we fail that test, we can't become a watchmaker. We don't get our watchmaking certificate. So there's a lot of pressure. It's kind of like sitting for the bar when you're trying to become a lawyer. You can't actually practice law if you haven't passed the bar exam. You still have your diploma from your law school, but that doesn't allow you to actually practice law. So the test can be quite stressful. The watchmaking schools are also quite small. Typical class size for a watchmaking school is about 8 students. Now, my class had 7, and we had 2 master watchmakers that taught us throughout 2 years, where we worked 40-hour work weeks. And at the end, we sat for the final test. Once we passed that test, that's like the prerequisite to getting a job for any Swiss watch company. And I was really fortunate. I immediately was offered a job from Audemars Piguet. And that would allow me to travel to Switzerland for the first time in my life. And that's a pretty big deal for a kid who's always loved watches. And just finally, after going to a watchmaking school, being able to visit Switzerland and go to a watchmaker as prestigious as Audemars Piguet. So I immediately accepted the job from Audemars Piguet and traveled to Le Brassus, Switzerland, which is a tiny little town up in the mountains outside of Geneva. Absolutely perfect setting for watchmaking. It's exactly what I always thought watchmaking was. Sitting in old buildings, looking out to the mountains and farmland in the snow, and making watches. After working with Audemars Piguet and getting more training, I accepted another job from Vacheron Constantin. Vacheron Constantin is another one of the most well-known high-end watchmakers in Switzerland. And I had the opportunity to travel to Plan-le-Ouat and learn complicated watchmaking with Vacheron Constantin. Again, another dream come true to be able to work and learn at one of the top Swiss brands. The watchmakers there were just unbelievable. The things they were working on, the amount of knowledge in the different workshops was incredible to see. Coming from America, where watchmaking is relatively unknown, and seeing young people in their 20s working side by side with 80-year-old watchmakers who have been doing this for way longer than I had been alive, was really spectacular. And to see that knowledge being passed on from watchmaker to watchmaker, I felt really, really special for being able to be a part of that and to learn from these other watchmakers. With everything I learned at Vacheron and at Audemars, I really felt that doors were opening, and I could kind of see into the industry and see how things are made and why things are made and what's really important about watches, why they're so special, why they make me feel the way I feel, right? Why I continue to collect and continue to love watches. When I went back to the US and continued working in service for Vacheron Constantin, I had an eye-opening experience where everything just kind of fell into place. And I realized we don't have to move to Switzerland to make watches. I could make watches right here in the US. It will be more challenging, but it might be more rewarding. So I started looking for machine shops. And I quickly discovered that there's no infrastructure in the US for making watch parts. So I had to work with different machine shops that make medical devices, machine shops that make aerospace parts, medical parts, and other kinds of small, turned, complex parts. But again, finding people that were willing to work with someone in an industry as foreign as watches was quite complex. I did manage to find one shop in Los Angeles with an owner who also loved watches and collected watches. And he was so interested in what I was trying to do that he agreed to make watch parts for us. And that was a huge deal. I have worked with them now for almost 10 years, making watch parts in the US. When I first started designing the watch, our 42mm field watch, I had some 3D printed versions made up in order to test the case and see how I like it on the wrist. So I still have one of the original prototypes that is a 3D printed case. So there's nothing inside, there's no movement. It's just a 3D printed case fit on a band, on a green canvas band. And that was the original design. And the design today is still very similar, only some very minor tweaks. That design was born in my apartment in Los Angeles 10 years ago. So my first watches were extremely simple. I only made one watch, and it had a black dial, a stainless steel case, and a green canvas strap. And I still make that watch today. I wanted the designs to be timeless, and I wanted to make as much as I could in the US because I'm an American watchmaker. So I made 10 watches to start, and my thought was, if I could make these 10 and I could sell these 10, that'll give me an idea. It'll allow me to kind of gauge if this is possible, if this is a good business idea, right? So I had these 10 watches, and I loaded up my girlfriend's Honda CRV, and together we drove up to San Francisco to show these 10 watches and debut our brand at this little pop-up called Northern Grade. I didn't sell any watches at the show, but I had a lot of interested people talking to me about watchmaking and explaining that I'm a watchmaker. I went to a watchmaking school and I made these watches. From those interactions, there were a few articles written. And from those articles, I sold all 10 watches in the first month. At that time, I asked my then girlfriend to marry me, and she said yes. We ended up eloping in Temescal Canyon at sunset, just her, me, and our dog, and 2 close friends. So we were married right around the launch of the brand. We're coming up on 10 years now, our 10-year anniversary, and also the 10-year anniversary of Weiss Watch Company. When I first started Weiss Watch Company, I was contracting out the manufacturing of components to different machine shops in the LA area and also around the US. I had some components coming from as far as New York City, and it would all come together in my apartment. I had watchmaking area set up in our dining room, and I would wake up and I would have to walk through the dining room to get to the kitchen for breakfast. I found that I would end up sitting down at the watchmaking bench before I even got to my breakfast, just because it was there, and I loved it so much. I would be in that dining room working on watches until it was dinner time. It was really a labor of love, and it couldn't have happened without the passion. That was when I realized I had made the right choice in leaving business school to pursue a passion first. I assembled watches, I polished components and finished components that were made in local machine shops. I even hand painted the dials for our first watches. So the brass blanks would be delivered from the machine shop, and I would hand paint them. I don't do paint anymore, and I'm very thankful I found other vendors to do the paint work. But at that time, it was one of those small business necessities where I had to learn how to paint watch dials by hand in order to make it happen, in order to make the business successful and to have something to show. Early on, a writer for the Los Angeles Times discovered what I was doing and wanted to meet for a lunch. I told him all about our story and how I was making the watches as local as I could and doing the assembly and finishing in my apartment, and he ended up writing a story about us. We had the photographer come in and we did an interview in my apartment, and thinking back to that is amazing to see that I had ultrasonic tanks next to my kitchen sink, and I had polishing equipment sitting in my living room. I had quality control testing machines in my living room as well, and a dining room with lathes and watchmaking benches. It's pretty spectacular to see. We ended up being on the front page of the LA Times with that article, and that completely changed the trajectory of our business. That's when I was able to grow into a dedicated workshop and purchase some of my own CNC machines. When the LA Times article was released, I sold all of the watches that I had planned to make for the holidays within 1 week of that article. That article came out in October. So I had to scramble to figure out how to make more parts so that I would be able to sell watches through the holidays. It was a huge turning point in the business because I was able to begin producing components with these partners that had machine shops in the area in reasonable quantities where we could actually get a little bit of economy of scale. And we were also able to have Whitney start working full-time with Weiss, not contracting any time out for other companies. In 2020, I moved the entire company, our CNC machines, all the workbenches. I moved everything from Los Angeles to Nashville, Tennessee. It was a big move for the business and a big move for me personally. I had a 2-year-old daughter and another daughter on the way. But coming to Nashville allowed me to expand the facility and increase the number of CNC machines we have, as well as purchase a building to ensure a future for the brand. Moving to Nashville is a big next step for Weiss Watch Company so that we can expand and produce more here in the US. My goal with Weiss has always been to bring watchmaking back to the US. We're really trying to restore prestige to American watchmaking. And what that means to me is making watch parts, creating a watch industry, and the infrastructure that's required to make watches. Whether that means designing watches or making every single little piece that goes into a watch. Without the infrastructure here and the knowledge here, there can't be a watch industry. So we have to start with that knowledge. And when we have that knowledge, then we can make watches in the US. So I slowly have been focusing on learning more and taking what I learn and translating that into watchmaking here in Nashville. Most of the growth that we've had in the business is because of my passion for watchmaking. I don't know of businessmen or businesswomen that would look at the investments I've made in this business and say those were sound business investments. But if I was to poll passionate watchmakers, they would all say that buying these machines and making these parts, that's right for being a watchmaker. So sometimes you have to let the passion drive the business to succeed. Because as soon as it's not fun anymore, then I don't really want to be doing it. I love watches, and that's why I make watches. That's why I've created this brand, and that's why I want to make parts and make watches and design watches here. It's because I love watches.